Boldwood presents Be Your Best Self, written by Maxine Morrey and read by Gloria Sanders. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. I hadn't always been a witch. The thought had never really occurred to me before I moved back to the village I grew up in. I lived in a semi-detached Victorian cottage with a wonderfully long garden backing onto a paddock, and had been happily growing ingredients for ointments, teas and tinctures for years, each season bringing with it a further appreciation of the nature around me than the one before. I was what is called a green witch. Or so my friend Crystal, who runs the local alternative therapy shop, told me. It's all about the peace and tranquility for me. "What the hell are you doing?" I yelled. Spud and I were just returning from our early morning walk in air that had a hint of early spring warmth. Above us, birds chirped and cheeped in the trees, the leaves of some tentatively unfurling as though testing the air to decide whether to continue just yet. The grass was vibrant and green beneath our feet, and the sun sparkled on the surface of the nearby stream, making it glitter and shimmer as it ambled its way along. Heading back into the village, I'd smiled as Spud's toenails clicked rhythmically on the pavement as he trotted along beside me, and turned towards home. And that's when I'd seen it. The mini digger, sinking its sharp metal teeth into my neighbour's front garden. The operator ignored me, the noise of the machine drowning my words. I waved my arms to catch his attention and repeated my question as he turned off the engine. "What are you doing?" "What I'm paid to." He gave a shrug and made to start the machine up again. "But you can't," I said. "Some of these roses are prime specimens." "Looks like a bit of a wilderness to me." The machine rumbled to life once more. "Well, yes, it is, I agree, at the moment," I shouted, trying to make myself heard above the din. "But the answer isn't just ripping everything out with a digger. It can be restored." "Is there a problem?" A deep voice cut across the noise, followed a moment later by its owner, who strode out from behind the huge skip that was slowly being filled with the contents of the garden. The digger's jaw turned away from me and scooped out the roots of a once beautiful but now admittedly overgrown cherry tree that was just beginning to bud with flower. It toppled and fell to the ground. "Oh!" I cried out, an almost physical pain scything through me at the destruction. "I asked if there was a problem." The man was close to the gate now, where I was standing. Spud had found a warm spot on the ground and was sunning himself, unaware of the tumult going on around him. "Yes, there is. This." I spread my arms to encompass the machinery and the garden. He didn't even take a moment to glance back. "What about it?" "You're destroying it." "No, I'm having an overgrown disaster zone cleared." "It's not that bad." He fixed me with a steady look, his deep green eyes almost daring me to quantify that statement. "Okay, fine. It is, but it doesn't have to be." "I know. That's rather the point of having the work done." "That's like using a sledgehammer to crack a pistachio." "Nut." "Pardon?" "The expression is to crack a nut." "I know what the bloody expression is, which is exactly why I chose something smaller that you can open with your fingers." Was I really standing here debating nuts with this stranger? "Oh, I see. Fair enough." The point is, I emphasised, that you're taking an overly heavy-handed approach. I see. He cleared his throat. Forgive me, but may I ask something? Yes? What exactly does any of this have to do with you? My name is Henry Darcy, and as far as memory serves, I paid a good deal of my own money to buy this house and was under the impression it was then mine to do with as I wished. I must have missed the part where I had to run everything past any random person walking by for approval. There's no need to be sarcastic. I'm just stating facts. Sarcastically. And I'm not some random person. I happen to live next door. I pointed at my side of the house. The man's head turned slowly to where I was indicating the sunshine yellow-painted front door, surrounded with terracotta flower pots of various sizes bursting with crocuses, hellebores, primroses, and some early daffodils. These would soon be followed by another wave of daffodils and narcissi, their flowers ranging from egg yolk yellow to ghostly white and everything in between. After that would come the tulips. Oh, how wonderful. His eyes returned to meet mine once more, his tone entirely flat. Yes, well, I'm not thrilled either. Morning, Willow! Jerry the postman wandered along and handed me 3 letters and a small package. All right, Doc. Hope you're not getting on the wrong side of Willow here. You know she's a witch, right? He gave a chuckle as we both just looked at him. The good kind, obviously. But I reckon she wouldn't be past turning the odd bloke into a frog if he gets on her wick too much. Ta-ta! And off he went, whistling slightly off-key. Henry was staring after him. Some of these plants are decades old, I prompted, seemingly jolting him out of his daze. Then it's probably about time to freshen things up, isn't it? That's not how a garden works. It may not be how your garden works, Ms. Haynes. Willow Haynes. He nodded. Ms. Haynes. And that's your prerogative. What I do, in and on my own property, is my business, and I'd thank you to respect that. Now, if you don't mind, I have things to do. He gave a sharp nod, turned around, and strode back through the side passage to where, craning my neck, I saw the back garden was being subjected to the same rough treatment. The whine of a chainsaw began to screech, and I winced, both from the sound and the thought of what it might be attacking. Come on, Spud, I called to the dog who was still chilling on the pavement. Time to go home. He looked up, pushed himself up onto his short, stubby legs, gave a stretch, and then trotted on and through the garden gate up to the yellow door. I closed the front door behind me, but it did little to drown out the sound of the destruction. I'd have to fish out the noise-cancelling headphones. Having worn them nearly all the time in London, I really only used them now when I travelled. It was a rare occurrence to have to dig them out here in the village, let alone in my own home. Oh, dreadful man. When I'd seen the removals van outside a few weeks ago, I'd been excited at the prospect of having neighbours again. I loved peace and quiet, but Mill Cottage was situated towards the edge of the village and a little apart from the rest of the houses. I'd adored my previous neighbour, and we'd become good friends over the years. But time had ticked on, and after her husband had passed a few years ago, Edie finally took the decision to move into a modern retirement flat nearer to her family. I totally understood that. The house was bigger than she needed and was getting too much to look after on her own, especially in the winter with the fuel bills going up and up. And the garden... Well, my new neighbour was right. Not that I'd admit that to his face. It had become a bit of a wilderness. They were long gardens, over 100 feet, typical of the period, and it did take work to keep on top of them. For me, my garden was a sanctuary. For Edie, I knew hers had become a burden. With Ted gone, she lost the will to continue with something they had once always done together. Gradually, nature had begun to reclaim its territory. But still, surely there was a less drastic solution than this. From outside, I heard the unmistakable sharp crack of a tree trunk splitting, and rushed to the window just in time to see the large sycamore that had stood close to our boundary fence crash to the ground. Turning, I grabbed my phone and pressed the contact for my best friend. "He's a monster," I said by way of a greeting. "Good morning to you too," Abby replied. "And who exactly is a monster?" "Sorry, hi. My new neighbour from hell." I hear he's more like heaven. Apparently, he's got the face of an angel and a body made for sin." "Well, yes, I suppose he is quite good-looking. I wasn't paying much attention, but his personality doesn't match up to it. Appearances can be deceptive. He's most definitely not heavenly." "You know he's called Darcy, right? Doctor Henry Darcy. He's joined the clinic as a new doctor. I bumped into Steve in the village and he was over the moon about it. Very skilled and well respected, apparently." "Yes, I did know. And I can assure you he's definitely no romantic hero in my eyes." "So, what exactly has he done to earn this defamation of character?" "He's ripping out Edie's garden. I mean, not just cutting it back, literally ripping it out. There are diggers and everything, and that lovely big sycamore has just been felled." "The one in the middle?" "Yes." "The one you used to moan about because it kept dropping seedlings, sucking all the moisture from the ground and shaded a good part of your border?" I paused. "That's not the point." "Maybe he's done you a favour. You never wanted to risk upsetting Edie by asking to have it trimmed, although I don't think it would have bothered her at all. I'm not sure she really cared by then, to be honest. Now it's gone. So, the problem's solved." "You're supposed to be on my side." Abby laughed. "I am, my lovely, but I think you're overreacting a bit." "Did you hear me? He's literally ripping everything out." "Wills, relax. Maybe he just wants to redo the garden to his own design. It was kind of a mess, and it is his house now." "Oh, I hate it when you're rational." "I know. Sorry about that. I do get why you're upset, but the truth is neither of us can do anything about it. And who knows? It might end up being even better than before if he's having it professionally landscaped." I let out a sigh as I pondered. That's true. I hadn't really thought of it that way. "OK, I better get on. I'll speak to you later." "Yep, thanks, Abs." "You're welcome. Talk to you later." Hopes for a more beautiful outdoor space than before were scuppered entirely when I returned from Spud's walk a few days later. "You have got to be kidding," I said as I halted in shock. Henry Darcy appeared from behind the van that was now parked outside the house. "Good morning. I'm guessing from your exclamation that you have an opinion on this, too." "On smothering the earth with plastic? Yes, I do, actually." "I thought you might," he replied, turning away. "You do know how appalling this fake grass stuff is for wildlife, and, well, the planet in general? It's effectively single-use plastic." "It's also convenient for my lifestyle." "You can hire people to mow real grass if you didn't want to do it yourself." "I do know that, But that's not the path I chose in the end, as you can see. "We starting round the back then, mate?" A solid-looking chap hefted a roll up onto his shoulder and was followed by a lanky, wiry lad carrying a bucket of tools. "Yes, just down there." Henry pointed to the side passage. "I'll be there in a minute." "Was there anything else?" He turned back to me, looking down from his substantial height advantage. There was a detached air about him. No warmth in his eyes, his expression unreadable. If I'd have had to pick an emotion, I'd have said bored. Would it matter if there was? He shifted his weight. "Right. I'll get on then, if you don't mind." "It doesn't really matter if I do mind, does it?" I replied petulantly. "No, I'm afraid it doesn't." With that, he strode off, following the same path the workman had taken, and disappeared from sight. "Hateful man!" I hissed between gritted teeth and stomped back to my side of the house, closed the door, unclipped Spud's lead, and attempted to calm down by doing some breathing exercises. These were not made any easier by the disco hits blaring out from the turf fitter's radio, deafening all wildlife, including me, within the vicinity. "Oh, that's just perfect," I seethed, stomping over to the kettle. As I reached for my mug, everything went quiet. Sort of. The back garden no longer sounded like a 1980s roller disco, which was something. I peered out of the French doors, careful to keep myself in the shadow of the curtain. My new neighbour was out there talking to the turf bloke and... Wait, was that a smile? No, it couldn't have been. It must have been a trick of the light. An actual smile would probably crack that annoyingly attractive, strong jaw. But either way, the radio was turned down to a much more bearable level, which I, and likely anything in the locality with ears, appreciated. Switching on the retro design radio in my workroom, the soothing sounds of classic FM drifted around the room, drowning out the last remnants of the competing music in next door's garden. I picked up my current project and sat down in the squashy, cosy lemon-yellow armchair by the window. Light streamed in through the glass, and birdsong drifted through the open window. Actually, now that the tree had gone, it was even brighter in this back room. Not that it wasn't just fine before. I tuned my brain into the classical piece playing, and set about gently repairing a well-loved teddy bear named Harold, who had recently been admitted to Willow's Hospital for Teddy Bears and Poorly Dollies. It had never been my greatest wish in life to set up the Teddy Hospital, and had in fact come about entirely by accident. Although I'd grown up in the village, I, like many when they leave school or university, thought the place was stifling me. Moving to the big, bad city was the only way I was going to find the space to spread my wings and live my dream. The fact I had no idea what that dream was neither here nor there at the time. I had a degree in business studies. Also because I'd had no idea what I wanted to do, and that seemed like a good grounding for most things. And I was ready to conquer the world. It rarely works like that, though, does it? Don't get me wrong, I had a good time. For a while. I got a job as a business analyst for a large corporation, made friends, went out and did all the things I felt like I was supposed to do. I even met the one. At least, I'd thought he was the one. Chapter 2. 7 years later, it had become unerringly obvious that neither of us were the right one for the other. Life in London grated on my nerves. I loved the museums and parks and architecture, but I could no longer bear the noise, the unending swarm of people, packing myself in on the tube every day like a sardine, only more smelly. especially in summer. It was just all too much. Mark didn't see it that way. Gradually, the things we'd thought we had in common became less and less. A good night for me was tucking myself into a cosy spot with a herbal tea and a good book. A good night for him was heading out to a bar and drinking. I no longer wanted that. And, as it turned out, he no longer wanted someone who didn't want that. Amazingly, and luckily, both of us stayed reasonable enough for the split to be amicable. So amicable, in fact, that I wasn't actually divorced yet. We'd filled in all the paperwork, split everything down the middle, and done everything we needed. But somehow we'd never quite got around to processing that final step. "Done it yet?" Abby asked the next time I saw her. "Nope," I replied, sliding in behind the table at our favoured local cafe. "Why not?" "Just haven't had time. Like I told you last week, and the week before, and the week before that." She shook her head. "It's not like there's any rush. I never meet anyone anyway." "Maybe you don't want to." She took a sip of her spring sunshine smoothie. "Oh, yum." I leant over and took a drag on her straw. "Ooh, I think I'm having smoothie envy." I went back to my own drink. "Although this wheatgrass wonder is pretty good." Abby wrinkled her nose, having known me long enough to spot a fib, even a teeny one. The truth was, it wasn't bad, but not a patch on hers. But it was doing me good. That was the important thing. I could always have a slice of their salted toffee cake to make up for how much good it was doing me. "You really should get it sorted. I'm amazed Mark hasn't wanted to already either. He told me he wouldn't marry again, so I guess he's not so bothered." "Why not?" "Get married again? I don't know. He just said he didn't think he was cut out for it." "But you are." I pulled a face as I sucked my straw. "You are," my friend reiterated. "I'm happy as I am." "Are you, though?" I opened my mouth to reply. "Truly?" Abby interrupted. "Swear on Spud's life that you wouldn't want to meet someone." Spud looked up at hearing his name. "It's all right, boy," I said, fishing out an emergency treat from my pocket. He took it gently and crunched away happily before resting his nose back on his paws, then returned to watching the world go by the window. Not that there was a lot to watch in the village, but he seemed content. I smiled down at him, ran my hand down his fluffy back before getting back to Abby's question. Was I happy on my own with Spud? "Ugh. Okay, fine. Yes, it would be nice. But let's face it, I'm hardly likely to meet someone, am I? Spud is the only man I can see in my life for the foreseeable future. Except in the fact that you do, of course, live next door to the most eligible bachelor in the region." "Dr. Grumpy? Yeah, that's never going to happen." "Why not? He can't be that bad." Actually, he seemed really nice when I went to see him. "What's wrong? You didn't tell me you were ill." "I'm not. Ed was getting antsy about that aching back I've had. I knew it wasn't anything to worry about, but you know what he's like." I did know what he was like. Ed had worshipped the ground Abby walked on for as long as I could remember. He'd been watching that day she'd had the fall, and wouldn't leave the hospital until he knew she was going to be okay. "But everything was all right? You're all right, aren't you?" I heard my voice pitch up. "I'm fine," Abby said, laughter in her voice. "You're as bad as Ed. Doctor Darcy was so nice and really reassuring. He scheduled a scan just to put our minds at rest." "When is the scan?" "I've had it." I opened my mouth, but Abby was there before me. And yes, everything is fine. He just told me to take it a little easier. I said you shouldn't try to wrestle that mattress out on your own. I know. And I promise I won't go overboard like that again. That was pretty quick to get the scan then. I know the clinic here is good, but still. Yeah, Abby pulled a face. I kind of blabbed about Ed being worried and so far away and started getting a bit upset, so Doctor Darcy managed to put a rush on it. He was really sweet and funny, actually. She gave a slightly too dreamy smile. Excuse me. Whilst I am grateful to him for getting you checked over double quick, I cannot sit by and listen to other praises being sung. In my experience, he is neither sweet nor funny. He's rude and a garden wrecker, and you're supposed to be on my side. I did tell you about the fake grass, right? Yes, you did, and I do agree that does seem a shame for nature and stuff, but... She gave a shrug. It is his house. He could have been a bit more polite about it, I grumped. He did seem a bit short from what you said. But then I suppose if someone asked you what the hell you were doing on your own property, you might be a bit uppity too. I gave a long draw on my smoothie before raising my eyes to my friends. Do you mind not being so intensely reasonable all the time? Sorry. I used to be a primary teacher, remember? I dealt with children all the time. Thanks. Abby giggled. Sorry, that came out wrong. Although... Ha ha, very funny. Penelope said he'd moved here from London. Bought it for cash, apparently. Penelope was another from our nursery school alma mater. One of us had mispronounced her name way back when, and decades later, the nickname was still firmly in play. I thought of my mortgage and sniffed. It's all right for some. Yeah, I know. Abby gave a flick of her eyebrows in agreement. But I guess property prices in London are so bonkers now, it's hardly surprising either. Shame I was renting when I lived there. Even back then we couldn't afford to get on the ladder. Probably a bit of a culture shock for him, moving down here. London, any city, is so anonymous. Nobody talks to each other. Now he's landed somewhere where everyone knows everyone's business. People actually talk to their neighbours. It must all feel a bit alien. Well, nobody made him move here, and frankly, I'm quite happy not to talk to him. Abby gave me one of the looks she had honed during her teacher days. I looked up at her through my lashes and stuck my bottom lip out in a massive sulky face. Perfect, Abby laughed, and before I knew it, snapped a photo. If that goes on the village chat thread, I will dig up Dr. Grumpy's fake turf and bury you under it. I'll just keep it as a bargaining chip for something like, I don't know. Finalising your divorce, for example? Ugh. I let my shoulders go slack and slumped forward, taking a slurp of my drink. It's in process. Why are you so hung up on that? It's not a big deal. It's a huge deal. It's like telling the universe that you're not interested in finding someone else because you're still, technically and legally, bound to your husband. I'm sure the universe has much bigger things to worry about than the state of my love life. You know what I mean. I know. There was something on breakfast telly the other day about manifesting. Have you ever thought about giving it a try? Not in a definitive way. I do try and keep my focus on the good stuff, but as for vision boards and stuff, no. I've never really dived into it that deeply. I slurped the last of my smoothie and pondered. You've got that look on your face. What look? That drifting off look. You get it when you have an idea for the house or the garden or another miracle way of fixing a bear that looks like it's had its last cuddle. I let out a gasp, my hand to my chest. Wash your mouth out. No bear has ever had its last cuddle. There is always a way. Abby grinned. Thanks to you and your magic skills. I smiled back, part of my mind drifting just as my bestie had said. Do you think I should do it? What's that? Abby said. Manifest my perfect man. Abby sat up straight, her wide, slightly gap-toothed grin lighting up her softly freckled face. You're going to try it? I gave a shrug, my smile matching hers as enthusiasm fizzed between us. Why not? But why stop at manifestation? I've already got some crystals in the house for good energy, but maybe I'm just doing everything a bit half-assed. If it's going to work, I need to throw myself into it utterly. Manifest the life I truly want. It's going to work. I know it. Got time for another drink to celebrate? Abby checked her phone for the time and said that she had. A few minutes later, we were clinking together our ginger, lemon and turmeric teas and toasting my new endeavour. Once I'd hugged Abby goodbye, I plopped Spud into the special basket I'd had made for him that attached to the front of my bicycle. It was like one of those old-fashioned butcher's or grocer's delivery baskets, but a little smaller, divided into two. One side was for shopping, library books and so on, and the other, with its cosy blanket, was my dog's personal transportation. He absolutely revelled in it, his tongue hanging out, tasting the wind, his little ears flapping as I propelled us along, friends and neighbours waving as we scooted past. Thoughts percolated in my mind as I pedalled in the warm sunshine. Crocuses smothered the verges, planted years ago by the residents in a huge planting drive, and now naturally multiplying, the purples, whites and yellows vibrant among the verdant grass. There were certain parts of my life, like this, that were already perfect. I loved living here with Spud. The loud, melodic song of a robin reached my ears, and I turned my head briefly to see him perched on a thick yew hedge bordering a garden, giving us a private concert. Yes, certain parts of my life were already more than I could wish for. As we came around the bend, near Mill Cottage, I was reminded of the areas of life that were most definitely less than perfect. I began slowing on the approach and saw Dr. Grumpy getting into his swanky sports car, the gate closing behind him on his plastic, sterile garden. I slowed my bike even more, hoping to avoid any interaction. But, as if sensing something, he looked up and, after a brief pause, raised a hand in a greeting so brief I wasn't entirely sure it had happened. He then slid behind the wheel and switched on the engine, which burbled for a moment or two before he put the car into gear and pulled out, driving smoothly past me. A brief nod the only other acknowledgement. He was already gone before I got a chance to give a cursory nod back. As he turned the corner, I dismounted my bike while still in motion. It took me ages to get the hang of that. Believe me, it's not so easy as they make it look in films. Ask me how I know. I wheeled it up the side passage of the house and parked it under the little lean-to I'd made there, before lifting Spud out and putting him down on the ground to go and do his usual circuit of the garden, checking for intruders, while I let myself in the back door and put the fresh bread I'd bought into the bread bin. After a few more rounds, Spud trotted in and started lapping noisily at his water bowl while I made myself a cuppa. "All clear out there, then?" I asked, as I added milk into my oversized bone china mug of Darjeeling tea. Spud looked up at me, gave an enthusiastic wag of his tail, and trotted back out of the open door, turning his head once to make sure I was following. We walked to the bottom of the garden, stopping every so often to admire and smell flowers and stroke tactile leaves. Admittedly, that was mostly me, but Spud did a fair amount of his own sniffing, undoubtedly for different reasons. Once at the bottom, I took a seat on an old Lutyens-style bench I'd got from an online marketplace. It had been in a bit of a state when I'd gone to take a look at it, but there was no sign of woodworm, and the structure of it looked pretty sound, so I'd snapped it up. I'd even managed to get the chap to bring it over to my place in his van for an extra $5. After a sand down and a bit of filler, I'd prepped and painted it a soft, pale green that helped it blend into the landscape. After that, I'd run up a cushion and covered some foam I'd had cut to size for the seat. I loved the look and shape of the bench, but you've got to admit they're not the most comfortable things to sit on for any length of time. With that and a few more weatherproof scatter cushions I'd sewn up after finding some dead stock designer fabric on sale, it was now a lovely place to sit and look out over the mill pond and paddock that lay behind the house. Hanging high in an almost cloudless blue sky, the sun shone down its warming rays. Spring was revving up to burst onto the scene in triumph. After a few minutes, soaking them up, I leant over and wound the handle of the nearby parasol until Spud, who'd hopped up onto the cushion and snuggled against me, and I were shaded and my brain could stop getting in a flap about my Celtic colouring. I inhaled deeply, then let it out, soft and slow, before repeating the exercise, feeling my entire body relax and soften as I did so. The only sounds around us were the sounds of nature. The soft splosh of a duck diving into the pond, bottom up, its tail feathers on display. The birds singing and calling in the trees, and in front of us the horse and donkeys in the field, who would occasionally let out a whinny or race each other up and down the paddock, their hooves thundering on the ground. Currently, they were happily chewing the grass on the far side. A trail of disturbed water on the pond fanned out as a moorhen paddled out to the centre, then turned and chugged back into the reeds. A robin gave out a cheerful song every so often, the strength of it defying the bird's size. Sparrows chirped and dashed back and forth between the shrubs and trees in my own garden and the various bird feeders dotted about, while Mr. and Mrs. Blackbird found goodies in the lawn and borders. Everything was so peaceful. It really was perfect. Squeal! Chapter 3. The sudden, ear-piercing screech made us both jump. Spud sniffed the air and looked both sleepy and discombobulated as I twisted on the bench and peered back up towards the house. The new folding doors to next door's kitchen were wide open, the noise of power tools whining shrill and loud through them. Great! I returned to the bucolic landscape in front of me, sat back with a thump and tried unsuccessfully to block out the sound. After another 5 minutes, I headed inside, Spud at my heels. I found my noise-cancelling headphones and rammed them onto my head once again, glaring at the party wall between me and my neighbour as I did so. It was dusk when I took Spud out for his evening walk. The warmth of the day still lingered, and the light jacket I wore was plenty to keep any hint of chill away. The birds had roosted for the evening, and the only sound was the occasional haunting hoot of an owl, now awake and looking for its supper. We did our usual evening loop, and I was busy chatting to Spud as we came up to the front of the house. I fished in my pocket for my key, and as I looked up, a tall shadow close by shifted. I halted, my heart suddenly hammering. Henry Darcy stepped from behind his car into the moonlight. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you." I put my hand to my chest. "What are you doing hiding down there?" I wasn't hiding. I was checking my tyre. For what? A puncture. Oh. Is it all right? No. I have a puncture. His tone was short. Oh, right. A thought flew into my mind. It wasn't me. Was that a smile? No, of course it wasn't. Shame, though. I was willing to bet he had a great smile. Clearly, I hadn't put my parasol up soon enough earlier in the day, and the sun had gone to my head. This was my grouchy, insensitive, nature-hating neighbour we were talking about. I didn't suspect you for a moment. Until now. He paused. Should you be walking around in the dark? I stood straighter. I do it every night. That's not what I asked. Just because people do things doesn't always mean they're safe. You're not in London now, Doctor Darcy. It would be hard not to notice that. I can't work out whether you think that's a good thing or you're regretting having moved. We'd made our way to my gate, and the porch light, combined with various fairy lights I had wound around the trunk of a flowering cherry and a mature plum tree, dispelled the shadows, throwing a gentle light onto my neighbour's features. How do you know I moved from London? Tammy told Penny, who told Abby, who in turn told me. He looked back at me, his face blank. Tammy? The estate agent you dealt with here? The one you got the keys from? Oh, right. Tammy was not going to be pleased she had been so easily forgotten. Nothing like client confidentiality when you're conducting business. Oh, for goodness sake, I snapped back, stepping through the waist-high wrought iron gate with its peeling paint. I waited for Spud to follow me, but he was busy sniffing along the bottom edge of the garden wall. She's an estate agent, not a criminal defence solicitor, and it's hardly something any normal neighbour wouldn't have told me themselves. There's not a lot of privacy in this village, is there? I think you're confusing privacy with anonymity, and if that's what you wanted, then you probably should have stayed in the city. He let out a short breath, which, with anyone else, I might have classified as a laugh. But this was Henry Darcy we were talking about. No thanks. Definitely had more than enough of that. I felt a smile touch my lips. You're rather hard to please, aren't you, Doctor Darcy? He looked down at me, his expression neutral. I guess that came in handy in his profession. So what are you going to do about your puncture? He glanced back at the car. Hope I can find someone to change it first thing tomorrow, I guess. I'm assisting a colleague with surgery at Exeter in the afternoon. Failing that, I assume there's a good, reliable taxi firm here somewhere. Give me your phone. I held out my hand. I beg your pardon? Please give me your phone. Why? God, you're the suspicious type, are you? Don't worry. I have no intention of calling you. What I do have is the name of both a very good mechanic who will know how to solve your problem quickly, and also a local taxi firm who, yes, are extremely reliable. If I put my number in your phone, you can send me a blank message and I can then reply with their contact information. Oh, I see, he replied, his voice quiet as he handed over his phone. It's locked. Oh, right, yes. He leant over me and pressed his thumb against the image of a fingerprint, and the device unlocked. Great. Okay, so this is my number. I handed it back to him. Now you send me a blank message and I can send those contacts on to you. When you speak to them, tell them Willow sent you. My phone gave a little tinkle like a tiny bell. I'd pulled it from my pocket and was already scrolling my contacts when I opened his text. He literally had sent me a blank one. I mean, I know I said to do that, but most people would have said hi or thanks or sent an emoji, just something, wouldn't they? I would. My eyes drifted past him to his plastic garden. Yes, I might, but as he'd continuously proved since he moved here, he and I had absolutely nothing in common. There. Done. His phone gave 2 generic beeps. He didn't even glance at it. Thanks. I appreciate that. Could have fooled me. Not a problem. I hope you get everything sorted. Come on, Spud. Spud was engrossed. I pulled a treat from my pocket. Oh, Spuddy! What's this? His ears perked up as I crouched down, biscuit in hand. Bribery? Needs must. He's very good normally, but occasionally he gets a whiff of a really good smell. Kind of like I had when my new neighbour had leant over me to unlock his phone. I pushed the thought out of my mind. Good night then, Willow. Night, I said, scooping Spud up and walking up the garden path. I hope the noise didn't bother you too much today, Henry called once I was a few steps away. I turned back to face him. I know that Edie and Ted hadn't updated things for some time. It was probably due a refurb. You're very good at not answering the actual question you're asked, aren't you? I gave a shrug as I shuffled Spud under the other arm to get my front door key from my pocket. Still, I'm sorry if it did. His Eton tones were clipped and banal, and if he'd actually sounded sorry, I'd have appreciated the comment more. Thanks. Good night. I closed the door behind me, plopped the dog down on the floor, and leant heavily against the solid oak, breathing out a sigh. The problem with living next door to the good doctor was that, despite the fact that everything he did annoyed me and that he looked at me like he'd be the first in the queue to suggest I have a ride on the old village ducking stool, he was really, really good-looking. I mean, like, unfairly so. Seriously, what the hell was the universe thinking when it landed him next door? Was it a test of some kind? Or did the power that be just think it would be a great jape to have what, on first glance, would seem the perfect chance to meet the perfect man, and then throw a spanner the size of Pluto into the works by making us so entirely different in our outlooks that even the thought of us getting together was ridiculous? On the surface, he seemed great. The village grapevine had reliably informed me that he'd been working as a trauma doctor in London for years, as well as several stints with Médecins Sans Frontières. Staff and patients alike down here were raving about him. Such a polite, empathetic and brilliant surgeon. I couldn't comment on the last one, but I'd been surprised at the first 2, as both those qualities had seemed thin on the ground on the few occasions we'd met. But it seemed I'd been outvoted on those aspects. And like I said earlier, he smelled like heaven. It was all going so well. But then, what happened? Did the universe get distracted or something? It's like it was dead on track, and then did a massive random swerve off course. Not only did he rip out all of the wonderful plants in the garden next door, but from what I'd seen, there was barely a jot of colour in his house either. Not that I was looking on purpose. I couldn't help it if he left the lights on when I took Spud out for his nightly walk. Seriously, the universe couldn't have got it more wrong. I thought back to my conversation with Abby. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps my signals had been a bit mixed, even if it was unintentional. I picked up my phone and scrolled through until I found Mark's contact. Tapping out a quick message, I pressed send. There. Step 1 complete. The longer I'd stayed in London, the more detached I'd become from it. I'd realised that I missed the countryside I'd grown up in, and the daily walks I'd begun to take in the parks weren't really cutting it. It had been at that point that I'd started reading about alternative medicines and connecting with nature more. Now, don't get me wrong, if you have something dire wrong with you or have an accident, you need to take the advice of people who know what they're doing and have expertise in the area. People like Dr. Henry Darcy, by all accounts. But since returning to the village, I'd become a big proponent of looking to the earth for help too. I had a tea border in my garden that was purely for growing plants for making teas and tinctures. Rosemary and feverfew for headaches, German chamomile for calm, and of course mint, among others. A cup of fresh mint tea in the morning picked from my garden set me up for the day like nothing else ever had. Over in my sage-coloured Victorian-style greenhouse, there were trays of calendula seedlings collected from last year's flowers for making a soothing balm, and around my back door, as well as over a wrought iron arch I'd rescued from a skip, grew beautiful fluffy-headed climbing roses for making rosewater and soaps. The scent on a warm summer's evening was wonderfully intoxicating, and I looked forward to seeing the fat buds full of promise develop each year. Then, of course, lining the meandering path that led down to the bench, swathes of lavender grew and would be swarming with bees once they flowered. I left a lot for the pollinators, but did cut some to dry for using in soaps and pillow sprays, not to mention my delicious speciality, lavender biscuits. Some of the older villagers would tell me I was just like my Nan, whose footsteps I was following in. There had still been so much to learn from her. But when I'd had the opportunity, I hadn't been interested. How I wished I could ask her all the questions now. Unfortunately, I'd never come across a potion for that. If I had, I knew she would have said things like that should be left well alone. Nan was always on the side of the light. So it must have taken quite some patience to see me through my goth phase growing up. Thankfully, it had been a very short one. Apparently I was too cheery to be a goth. But I did hope that Nan was looking down on me, happy with how I was treading the same path, tending my garden the same as she had done years ago. Nan had passed away sitting on her garden bench in the evening sunshine. I like to think she knew she was going and decided where it was going to happen. I still didn't know how I'd found a voice to speak at her funeral. But when something is important enough, you make it happen, don't you? And I'd stood up there in front of what felt like the whole village and more, thanking her for raising me. She'd been a force of nature, but carefully wrapped in a soft soul full of love, wisdom, and kindness. There wasn't a day I didn't miss her or think about her. I hoped that wherever she was, whatever plane she was on, she thought about me too. I'd always believed in a deep connection with the earth and nature, probably again influenced by my Nan. But somewhere along the way I'd lost myself. Nan had passed away unexpectedly during my first year of uni. Suddenly she was gone, and I wasn't entirely sure where that left me. I'd switched from studying English literature to a business degree, and as soon as I'd graduated, I'd gone to London to find myself, kick some ass, and discover who I really was. Years of false trails led me nowhere, and it was only when I came home to the village that the Willow I knew, the one I recognised from deep down, began to emerge and bloom. And I was finally happy. I had a beautiful house. Yes, it always needed something doing, but that's the way with old houses. The walls were solid and it was gorgeous. The Victorians really knew how to build stuff to last. I enjoyed doing it up, as much as possible learning and using my own skills so as to save money. Of course, it would have been nice to be able to afford to have it all done in one go like my neighbour, but not all of us had those resources. I certainly didn't. Another difference between us. Another slip-up by the higher power. And actually, I got a lot of satisfaction from the work I put into my house and garden. Would Doctor Darcy be able to say that? Did he even care? I pottered into the kitchen and took the milk bottle from the fridge. Having poured some into a pan, I set it to heat on the Aga. It came with the house and was a right state when I moved in, but she was a beauty now. Then walked through to the cosy living room and ran my fingers gently along the spines of my books, stopping occasionally to pull one out. Heading back into the kitchen, I melted a couple of squares of chocolate into the pan and then poured the mixture into a mug with Spud's face on. Abby had had it painted for me as a birthday present when I'd got him. It was my favourite, and I always saved it for my bedtime drink. "I'm heading up, Spud." I opened the French doors to let him out to do what he needed to do, and waited as he wiped his feet on the mat, one of his most impressive, not to mention useful, tricks. I locked up behind him and made my way to the foot of the stairs. Spud headed up in front of me, having stopped only to collect Colin the cabbage, a squeaky plush cabbage with a cheery face that Ed had bought for him, and which, for reasons best known to Spud, immediately became his favourite toy. By the time I got up the stairs with my drink and books, Spud was curled up in his bed beside mine, his paws around Colin and his head resting gently on top of him. Warmth flooded through me, swelling my heart with joy. How had I ever lived without this dog? He had not only made me fitter, but had made me smile and laugh every single day since I'd picked him up as a pup from the shelter. In that compact, fuzzy little parcel was everything I needed. Well, almost everything. "So, Spud," I said, tucking myself in under the duvet and picking up one of the books.